Thanks to advancements in technology and subsequent changes in our viewing habits, we now live in an era of big marquee TV shows and series that aren't even necessarily on TV anymore. It's probably fair to say that shows like Game of Thrones, The Walking Dead, House of Cards, and Breaking Bad are great examples of how, in the 2010s at least, the small screen has dominated the silver screen, with many critics saying that Hollywood has become stale and predictable, while the real entertainment that everyone's talking about has been on TV. I say TV, but as everybody knows, many of the previously mentioned blockbuster shows I just mentioned aren't even produced by traditional TV networks anymore. As streaming services like Netflix and Amazon Prime have become more stable and viable, more and more of these big marquee TV events are being produced exclusively by these companies for broadcast on their own platforms. So while we've been waiting for the next installment of The Mandalorian on Disney Plus or binge rewatch the entire catalogue of The Ozarks on Netflix before the new season comes out, one show has been steadily holding up that big marquee wedding tent while some of its pegs have inevitably come flying loose thanks to your drunk Uncle Jerry crashing through them after drinking one too many celebratory beverages at your sister's wedding. The show I'm talking about here is The Expanse. The Expanse is a science fiction show based on a series of novels by James S.A. Corey. The show is set in a not too distant future where, thanks to some radical developments in propulsion technology, mankind has colonized the Moon, Mars, and even some of the moons of Jupiter and larger asteroids of the outer solar system. Each civilization in The Expanse is greatly defined by its own unique environment and is described to a level of detail that's rarely seen in any fictional TV series or movie without overdoing it so that it might disinterest or even confuse casual viewers. In the universe of The Expanse, Earth is governed entirely by the United Nations and its population has blown out to over 30 billion. The world is almost entirely reliant on its off-world colonies and stations for resources, and its bloated population means that much of its citizens can't even get a job even if they wanted one, as positions in education and industry are limited and require applying to huge waiting lists that many will never reach the front of in their lifetimes. As a result, much of Earth's population live on government handouts and are referred to as takers by those outside of Earth. Speaking of outside of Earth, the next major civilization in the story are the Martians. Now, when we hear the word Martian, we might think of little green men, but in The Expanse, the Martians are humans who have settled and colonized Mars. Initially, colonization began on Mars under the umbrella of the United Nations on Earth, but over time, the inhabitants of Mars identified less and less with their brethren on Earth. They developed their own culture, and ultimately, they defined themselves on their unity and ultimate goal of terraforming Mars. In the story, Mars is formally known as the Mars Congressional Republic. They are a proud, independent nation with their own military. It's hinted that a good deal of animosity has built between Earth and Mars over the past century. So much so that there's a sort of cold war between the two planets, and an escalating arms race. Earth has the bigger navy with more manpower, but Mars has better technology and a better trained military. While Earthers are often portrayed as self-centered and lazy, Martians are seen to be very self-motivated, hard-working, straight-laced, and are sometimes so overzealous in their disdain for Earthers that it's sometimes a weakness of theirs. The third and possibly most fascinating civilization of The Expanse are the Belters. Unlike the superpowers of Earth and Mars, or Inners, as the Belters call them, the Belters aren't an organized nation. The Belters are inhabitants of the various stations built on asteroids and moons scattered throughout the solar system. They are the descendants of people from all over Earth who ventured out into the solar system to work on mining resources for the inner planets. One term often used to refer to Belters is rockhopper, as many Belters make their living hauling resource-rich asteroids to mining stations throughout the solar system. It's never made clear, but because the stations where the Belters live are usually installations funded and built by private companies based on either Earth or Mars, it's probably fair to say that the Belters themselves are sort of quasi-citizens of the United Nations without the full privileges enjoyed by those living on Earth. Because the Belters lack any official centralized government, their lives are very much at the whim of the Inners who dictate where they can live, work, even how much water and air they receive. Over the years, this has bred a great deal of resentment among Belters towards Inners, which has led to the formation of the OPA, or Outer Planetary Alliance, a sort of half-political organization, half-militant movement reminiscent of real-life organizations like the PLO. Life for Belters is tough. They are hard-working, blue-collar types who have never known the security of freely flowing air and water that Earthers take for granted. Not only that, but the fact that they are born and raised in low or zero gravity means that they are physically weaker and frailer than humans raised on Earth or Mars, and as such, they could never survive the gravity of an actual planet. Perhaps the Belters' greatest, most interesting feature, though, is their unique culture and language. Belters speak a Creole that is a mixture of English, Chinese, Japanese, German, and even Korean.
Oye, Beltalada.
Evita, Misatara. I have one more record for all the rest I crush.
They also use a lot of hand gestures that are born out of necessity from working in spacesuits that often had no audio communications. The writers and creators of The Expanse go to great lengths to show us how the Belters, while being human, have become a very distinct culture with their own unique concerns and motivations. The show follows the adventures of the crew of a small ship called the Rocinante. The ship's crew are a mix of Earther, Martian, and Belter who all worked for a mining company, and due to some extraordinary circumstances, have all ended up working together on the one ship. You could say the main protagonist is James Holden. He's the ship's captain and is an Earther who comes from some weird collectivist family where there are like 8 dudes and only 1 woman. Holden used to be in the UN Navy, but he eventually quit due to his morals. Holden is very idealistic and is the closest thing in the show to a traditional quote-unquote hero, in that he's the baby-faced do-gooder with a conscience, and he's always trying to do the right thing. Next, there's Naomi Nagata, a very talented Belter engineer who represents the consciousness and plight of Belters in the show, but is also placed in a very difficult position in that she works so closely with her Earther and Martian crewmates. Her position is often made more difficult given the fact that she and Holden are romantically involved. Then there's Martian Alex Kamal, a former Martian Navy pilot turned commercial rock hopper. He loves and misses Mars, but it's often hinted that he probably wasn't the best father and family man, because he's somewhat estranged from his wife and kids back on Mars. Thanks to a large influx of Texans settling the Mariner Valley colony on Mars, Alex speaks with a very distinctive drawl and has a predilection for country and western music. And rounding out the crew of the Rocinante is Amos Burton. Amos is a mechanic with a shady past. He grew up on the streets of Baltimore where he was involved with local gangs and a mafia-type organization. It's even hinted that he may have been a sex worker during his childhood. Despite his often flippant and carefree attitude, Amos has clearly had a very dark and disturbing past. He's obviously the muscle of the cast, but he's actually the most multidimensional of all the characters on the show in my opinion. The character of Amos is one of the main reasons why I love The Expanse. At first, Amos comes across as your typical meathead. He's a big, tough guy who doesn't say a lot, but what he does say at times is incredibly deep and very, very interesting. There are times when you think Amos has a softer side to his gruff, macho exterior, and he clearly does have that, but then there are certain seemingly random emotions that he doesn't appear to possess at all. Even Amos's sexual tastes and preferences appear to be unpredictable, as he often receives advances from both men and women, and it's occasionally hinted that he's sexually attracted to UN Secretary General Christian Avasarala, a woman who has to be at least twice his age. Well, each to their own, eh? But anyway, there's a lot going on under the hood with Amos, and I find the unpredictability of the character fascinating. So, without getting into spoilery details, the main plot of The Expanse is centered around the appearance of a mysterious extraterrestrial substance known as the proto-molecule. The proto-molecule appears to be some sort of blue goo, but what is it exactly? Nobody really knows. It can do incredible things like take over life forms and even inanimate objects, and enhance and completely re-engineer them at a molecular level. It even appears to be sentient, or at least be connected to some kind of intelligence somewhere. The proto-molecule appears on the scene as some kind of discovery made by scientists. How these scientists got hold of it is unknown, but what we do know is that it's incredibly powerful, unpredictable, and extremely dangerous, and a shady third party is trying to engineer the proto-molecule as some sort of bioweapon and sell it to the highest bidder. Somehow, the proto-molecule leaks and the crew of the Rocinante accidentally become the ones to discover this. I say the proto-molecule is the main driving plot of the entire story, and it is, But in the first season, a lot of the story is built around the fact that tensions between Earth and Mars appear to be rising. At the same time, the Belters and their political or militant arm, the OPA, are also becoming increasingly vocal and bolder in their actions. There's also a very long, convoluted whodunit sort of mystery subplot throughout Season 1, which I will admit at times confused me, and by the end of the season it seemed far more complex than it needed to be. In fact, when I first watched Season 1, I thought the main character of the show was the Belter detective and man with an interesting haircut called Miller, who is investigating this whole case. It could be argued at this point that Miller is the show's main protagonist, and he sort of is at this point, but his arc more or less ends by the end of Season 1. Despite the sometimes convoluted nature of Miller's plot arc, the last few episodes of Season 1 summarize it all pretty well. The ever-growing threat of the proto-molecule and the potential severity of its outcomes remind me a bit of Game of Thrones in that everyone's too busy bickering over what is ultimately small and trivial to see the massive threat that's coming to kill us all. Only that, up until now at least, unlike Game of Thrones, The Expanse hasn't turned out to be a massive disappointment. In fact, with only one more season to go, the show's quality has only gotten better and better, and it shows no signs of deviating from that path. Things tighten up by Series 2, and I found the plot and subplots a lot easier to follow. Season 2 is essentially about the proto-molecule doing some really wild shit that finally scares the bejesus out of everyone in the solar system. We get a lot more insight on Mars, what it's like there and its people. In particular, we're introduced to a new character called Bobby Draper, a Martian Marine played by New Zealand actress Frankie Adams. Bobby's trained to fight Earth her whole life, and she illustrates the attitudes of more or less all Martians in the show. She's very driven, motivated, and sometimes shows an overly zealous need to show her disgust for Earth and anything to do with the place. The Belt and the OPA are also becoming increasingly impatient, and we are introduced to another really interesting character called Fred Johnson, an OPA leader played by Chad Coleman, also known as Z in It's Always Sunny and Tyrese in The Walking Dead, back when it was actually good. Fred Johnson is another really interesting character that has mysterious motives. He seems to be a very charming, charismatic man who appears to have humanity's best interests at heart, but he has a very dark past, and we see him do some pretty questionable things every now and then in Season 2. And honestly, I think Chad Coleman deserves a lot more leading roles in the future. In later seasons, the threat and mystery of the proto-molecule remains, but it takes more of a backseat as the show settles into season-long arcs. A major arc in the entire story is political intrigue and backstabbing, in which the foul-mouthed UN Secretary-General Avasarala,
I know how the fucking thing works. What the fuck is this? Whoever the fuck you are, just get to the fucking point.
Plays a central role. There are also stories that focus on the exploitation of the weak and more marginalized members of society. But for me, the thing I enjoy the most about the stories of The Expanse is that it's set in a time when humanity is facing a massive change that will dramatically alter the course of mankind. Kind of like the discovery of the New World or the Industrial Revolution, the discovery of the proto-molecule leads to technological abilities that were previously only dreamed of. It puts a great deal of stress on some factions, while for others, it presents an unprecedented opportunity. I was particularly fascinated with how the Martians react to all of this. For a society that's so motivated and sure of itself, they seem to take the shift the worst, and it causes them to suffer a sort of existential crisis. I think it wouldn't be right to not point out that The Expanse has to be one of the most realistic sci-fi shows ever made. I know realistic and sci-fi sounds like a bit of an oxymoron, but the source material and the show's creators have spent an incredible amount of time and effort on the details, especially on things like physics. The show is set in the future, but it's not that far into the future. Mankind can reach parts of our solar system faster than ever before, but we're still not that fast really. The technology and the look and the feel of The Expanse is very similar to present day. The ships can travel fast, but they're basically the equivalent of slapping an incredibly fast engine onto a bus. There's no atmosphere in space to cause drag, so you don't need aerodynamics. For the most part, ships look extremely functional, as if they were office buildings with other smaller buildings tacked onto their sides. We're also often reminded throughout the show that the G-forces produced by traveling at such speeds is potentially fatal to the human body. Even simple things like turning too sharply or stopping too quickly could cause a massive stroke for everyone on board. Just like the way that water is a constant force in the story of Dune, gravity is constantly affecting the story of The Expanse. Sometimes there's too much of it, and sometimes there's too little. Even the just right amount of gravity that we're used to here on Earth can be potentially fatal to someone who was born and raised in a low-G environment, and the show goes to great pains to show these effects. Every now and then we see cool little details, like someone pouring a drink in a low-G environment, people walking on what looks to be the ceiling, but because there's no gravity, they're actually just using magnetic boots to walk wherever they can, and even what getting critically wounded would look like in zero gravity. The world building in this show is second to none. I love how the world is believable, not just because it looks similar to our present day or that the laws of physics seem to apply, but you get a real sense of each faction's culture because, like the attention to science, just as much attention has been put into creating the worlds where the people of the Expanse come from. One thing I've really enjoyed about the world of the Expanse is the diversity, and I'm not talking about the type of diversity politics that dominates a lot of Hollywood productions these days. The worlds of the Expanse are incredibly diverse because we're talking about all of humanity spreading out into the stars, whereas in the past, many TV shows were typically built around or focus on the culture of the country it's produced in. For instance, Mars appears to be settled by predominantly a mix of English-speaking peoples and Chinese. Every scene involving a Martian ship or location has writing or announcement in both Chinese and English. The Belt is incredibly diverse. Their diversity is best seen in their language, but ethnically too. The Belters are a visible melting pot. The show's diversity feels completely organic because, in a harsh, unforgiving environment like space, who really cares what color or gender you are? If you're alive in space, it's because you're good at surviving, and that's validation enough. Obviously, I think almost any sci-fi fan will enjoy The Expanse, but I also believe the show can appeal to general audiences too. I like sci-fi as much as the next guy, but I can totally understand why some people are turned off by the genre. The Expanse is something for everyone without going too far in one direction. At the time of recording, Season 5 has just finished. Season 6 will be the finale, and hopefully it'll be out by the end of 2021, but with the way things are at the moment, we might not see that final installment of The Expanse until 2022. Fingers crossed though that it does come out sooner rather than later. So there you have it. That's a brief overview of what The Expanse is about without going into so much detail that would spoil it. Hopefully this has whetted your appetite. Go watch The Expanse. It's seriously that good.